Good evening, brothers and sisters, and all who listen. Tonight we are to look at the character of Saul. He was, as we know, the first king of the nation of Israel, the people God had specifically called to be a people after his own name. As we read, Moses had foreseen that the nation would at some point in the future wish to have a visible leader for themselves and to be like the nations round about them. Did he warn them to take only one whom the Lord would choose to be their king? One who would be modest in his requirements, not amassing to himself horses, wives, or silver and gold, but who would keep God's law and statutes and not magnify himself in his own mind. He was to make a personal copy of the law and to read it daily. We know the outcome of their choice, that he finally turned out not to be such a good choice, but somebody who was self-willed and from whom God departed from in the end. And all this despite the fact that he'd been chosen by God in the first place. So how did things go so wrong? I'm going to look at several aspects of Saul's character and how they developed throughout his life. And finally, we can look at any lessons that we might learn to apply in our own lives. First question we should perhaps consider is, why did the people of Israel consider the need for a king? And also perhaps why now? Israel had been a nation since Abraham was called out from Ur of the Chaldees. Since this time, God had been their notional head. They'd had a series of judges, some of who had been God-fearing, and during whose leadership the nation had flourished. But inevitably, they'd fallen into idolatrous habits when these judges had died. And God had subsequently punished them. The last judge had been Samuel. He had two sons, whom he had hoped would continue to advise and lead the people after him. However, we learn that they were not made of the same spiritual stuff as their father. Behold, you are old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations, we read in 1 Samuel 8 and verse 5. We go back to verse 1, we see how this situation arose. And it came to pass when Samuel was old, that he made his sons judges over Israel. Now the name of the firstborn was Joel, and the name of the second Abiah. They were judges in Beersheba. And his sons walked not in his ways, but turned aside after lucre, and took bribes and perverted judgment. Then all the elders of Israel gathered themselves together, and came to Samuel to Ramah, and said unto him, Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us, like all the nations. Samuel was obviously still held in high regard, and the elders consulted him about their wishes, even though he delegated a lot of his duties to his sons. They'd presumably been in post for some time in order that their shortcomings had become generally known. The desire to be like their neighbours and to have a visible king ruling over them had been a long-standing one for the elders of Israel. Back in the days of Gideon, after he'd defeated the Midianites, they had suggested to him that he reigned over them as king. We see in Judges 8:2. Then the men of Israel said unto Gideon, Rule thou over us, both thou and thy son's son also, for thou hast delivered us from the hand of Midian. And Gideon said unto them, I will not rule over you, neither shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. Samuel was obviously hurt that the people should desire a king. He says, after Samuel was crowned, He said unto me, Nay, but a king shall reign over us, when the Lord your God was your king. He took the slight against God personally, but God points out that it was he whom the people had rejected and not Samuel. And the Lord said unto Samuel, Hearken unto the voice of the people in all that they say unto thee, for they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. So Samuel accepts their decision, though he warns them about what they can expect that a king may demand. Chapter 8 again of the 1 Samuel from verse 10. And Samuel told all the words of the Lord unto the people, that asked of him a king, and he said, "This will be the man of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for himself, for his chariots, and to be his horsemen. And some shall run before his chariots, and he will appoint him captains over thousands and captains over fifties, and will set them over his ground to reap his harvest, and to make his instruments of war and instruments of his chariots. And he will take your daughters to be confectionaries, and to be cooks, and to be bakers. And he will take your fields and your vineyards and your olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. And he will take the tenth of your seed and of your vineyards, and give to his officers and to his servants. And he will take your men servants and your maid servants, and your goodliest young men and your asses, and put them to his work. He will take a tenth of your sheep, and ye shall be his servants. And you shall cry out in the day because your king which you have chosen you, and the Lord will not hear you in that day." So Samuel shows them the error of their request and the likely character of their chosen monarch, even though they'd yet to make a choice. He knew that despite the best of intentions that they might have initially, despite the warnings and advice of Moses, that human nature would eventually become the guiding force. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. This summary surely reflects the anger of God implied in his comment to Samuel that we saw earlier. It's interesting to consider that the people still had Samuel in high regard, despite the fact that his sons had taken over some of his duties. They came to him requesting he chose them a king. They weren't going to undertake the task themselves. Samuel sends them away and consults with God as to whom he would choose to rule over his people. Samuel is to anoint Saul as the future king of Israel. However, the process by which this is accomplished is somewhat convoluted, as you will remember. We haven't time to look into this now in any detail, but there are a couple of things that we should look at possibly to give an indication of Saul's character. He was not one that one might initially think of as making an ideal leader. We first come across him when he is tasked with finding some lost asses by his father. Indeed, the only thing that stands out is his appearance. He was certainly a handsome, tall man. 1 Samuel 9, verse 1. Now there was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Becheroth, the son of Aphir, a Benjamite, a mighty man of power. And he had a son whose name was Saul, a choice young man and a goodly. And there was not among the children of Israel a goodlier person than he. From his shoulders and upward, he was higher than any of the people. And the asses of Saul's father were lost. And Kish said to Saul his son, "Take now one of the servants with thee, and arise, go seek the asses." And he passed through Mount Ephraim, and passed through the land of Shalisha, and they found them not. And they passed through the land of Shalim, and there they were not. And they passed through the land of the Benjaminites, but they found them not. And when they were come to the land of Zuph, Saul said to his servant that was with him, "Come, let us return, lest my father leave caring for the asses, and take thought for us." And he said unto them, "Behold now, there is in the city a man of God, and he is an honourable man. All that he saith cometh surely to pass. Now let us go thither, peradventure he can show us our way that we should go." Then said Saul to his servants, "But behold, if we go, what shall we bring the man? For the bread is spent in our vessels, and there is not a present to bring the man of God. What have we?" And the servant answered Saul again and said, "Behold, I have here at hand the fourth part of a shekel of silver. That will I give the man of God, to tell us our way." Verse 10. Then said Saul to his servant, "Well said, come, let us go." So they went into the city where the man of God was. So here we're introduced to Saul. He was, it seems, from a reasonably wealthy family, as they had servants. He was tall and handsome, and described as young, though this probably means in the prime of life, as Jonathan, his son, is described as a commander in the army not so long after. And Jonathan was probably of a similar age to David. So we see a man entrusted with the task of finding his father's asses. Though this may well be considered a rather menial task, and having little success, he demonstrates his concern for his father and suggesting that they return home. Possibly his father was unwell. Certainly we don't hear from him again. It appears that Ner, Saul's uncle, takes on the responsibility of his father from this time. He demonstrates his humility and his willingness to take advice from his servant. So they seek Samuel. Saul would appear to have known little about Samuel the prophet, relying on his servant to enlighten him about the ability of Samuel to tell him about the asses. Are we led to understand that Saul knew little about the practice of religion? They're not far from the circuit Samuel made in his teaching activities. The local people knew and respected him as their leader. Saul, it seems, knew little about Samuel, though his servant, living in the same household, would appear to have not only knowledge about where Samuel lived, but also enough faith to think that he would be able to help them. As they approached the town, they met a group of young girls whom they asked about Samuel. They reassured them that he was indeed in the town and about to go to offer a sacrifice. As they continued their way up the hill, Ramah means height, so the town was built on a hill, they met Samuel, and Saul asks him where the seer lived. Obviously, he didn't recognize Samuel, even in his prophet's garments. We're told that Samuel was expecting Saul. The Lord had told him earlier, in his ear, we learn, the previous day, and indeed now pointed out that this was Saul, whom he was to anoint to be their king. Chapter 9, again, verse 16. Tomorrow about this time I will send thee a man out of the land of Benjamin, and thou shalt anoint him to be captain over my people Israel, that he may save my people out of the hand of the Philistines. For I have looked upon my people, because their cries come unto me. And when Samuel saw Saul, the Lord said unto him, Behold, the man whom I spake to thee of, this same shall reign over my people. So Saul meets Samuel, who has been tasked by God to anoint him as the future king of Israel. First, he demonstrates his knowledge of Saul, and indeed what brought him here, by reassuring him about the asses. Verse 19 of chapter 9. And Samuel answered Saul and said, I am the seer. Go up before me into the high place, for you shall eat with me today, and tomorrow I will let thee go, and will tell thee all that is in thine heart. And as for thine asses, that were lost 3 days ago, set not thine mind upon them, for they are found. And on whom is all the desire of Israel? Is it not on thee, and on thy father's house? And Saul answered and said, Am not I a Benjamite, of the smallest of the tribes of Israel, and my family the least of all the families of the tribe of Benjamin? Wherefore then speakest thou so to me? So Saul is taken aback by Samuel's answer. Does a comment about what was on his heart reflect that he had been thinking of the events going on with respect to the choosing of a king? Was he secretly thinking that he might make a good candidate for the king? His response, however, perhaps reflects his reticence and his humility. Saul is invited up to the feast taking place following the sacrifice. Then he goes back with Samuel to his house, where he spends the night before setting off early for home. Samuel initially accompanies the two men out of town, then suggests the servant carries on while he talks to Saul. Then he anoints him with oil secretly. Only the two of them are aware of what takes place. 1 Samuel 10, verse 1. Then Samuel took a vial of oil and poured it on his head, and kissed him, and said, Is it not because the Lord hath anointed thee to be captain over his inheritance? So Saul goes home and encounters several of the signs that Samuel has told him of, finally joining with a group of prophets. Presumably by then his servant had gone ahead, as we don't hear any more of him until they get home. We learn, however, that after Samuel leaves him, God gave him another heart. Saul keeps these things secret from his family. He's questioned by his uncle Ner, possibly his father Kish having died during his absence, but says nothing about the anointing with oil. Samuel then calls the people together to Mizpah, where he was to help them to decide on the choice of the king. It transpires that their future king is to be chosen by lot, initially choosing the tribe and subsequently the family and then the individual. Benjamin is chosen, and then from this tribe, Saul is finally chosen by lot. However, when he is looked for, he could not be found. He had hidden himself. Having been found, however, Samuel says, and Samuel said to all the people, verse 10, "See him whom the Lord hath chosen, that there is none like him among all the people." And all the people shouted and said, "God save the king." Samuel sends all the people away, and Saul too goes back home and continues work on the family farm. So it seems there was a significant amount of organising to arrange for a change of leadership of the people and to start the monarchy. The group of people went home with Saul, whose heart God had touched, we are told. These men may well have been from the group of prophets that met Saul on his way home. There was, however, also a faction of the children of Belial, we learn, who would not accept Saul as being their king. Then came the incident concerning Jabesh Gilead. Jabesh was a town on the other side of the Jordan that had been conquered from the Amorites in the time of Moses, but had beforehand been part of the Ammonite kingdom. It was from here that the virgins were taken for the men of Benjamin who survived the massacre after the episode of the Levite whose concubine was killed in Gibeah. Saul was descended from one of these women from Jabesh. Nahash, an Ammonite, besieged Jabesh Gilead and threatened to destroy them. The alternative, if they wanted to make a covenant with them, was for them to submit to having the right eyes of all the men of war removed. He gave them a week to decide their fate, but allowed messengers to leave to try and find help for them. The messenger arrived in Gibeah of Saul. The townspeople were understandably upset by the news. Saul, however, was out working in the fields and didn't hear of this until he returned home. On hearing the news, the Spirit of God came upon him, we are told, and his anger was kindled greatly. He acted immediately. He took a yoke of oxen and cut them into 12 pieces and sent them to the leaders of the tribes throughout Israel, demanding that anybody who did not come to support Saul and Samuel would have their oxen so killed. The men of Israel responded and came to the rescue of the people of Jabesh, destroying the Ammonite armies. No doubt the act of dividing the oxen reminded the people of the previous incidents in Gibeah, when the concubine had been divided up and sent throughout the land. Here Saul acts decisively and includes Samuel in his plan. He organised the attack on the Ammonites, dividing his troops into 3 bands. This destruction of the Ammonites and the saving of the people of Jabesh as a result of his actions cemented his place as that of king. The dissenters were silenced. He next showed his mercy in that following the victory, the people were all for rounding up those who had questioned Saul's fitness to reign over them and slaying them. But Saul was not having any of that. He says, verse 13 of 1 Samuel 11, "And Saul said, There shall not a man be put to death this day, for today the Lord hath wrought salvation in Israel." So here are 2 promising signs in Saul's character. He responded to the challenge of leadership promptly and subsequently showed mercy on the dissenters. Samuel then calls the people to Gilgal to confirm Saul's kingship. Verse 14 of 1 Samuel 11, "Then said Samuel to the people, Come, let us go to Gilgal and renew the kingdom there. And all the people went to Gilgal, and there they made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal. And there they sacrificed sacrifices of peace offerings before the Lord. And there Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly." Next we come to the apparent turning point in Saul's reign. The Philistines were causing a lot of problems for the Israelites. They were marauding the land from their strongholds, stealing crops and livestock. And added to this, they'd made sure the Israelites were unable to make themselves weapons by removing any forge, so that even to sharpen their farming implements required the help of the Philistines, at great expense, no doubt. After he had reigned 2 years, we read, though the text is unclear here, translated differently in different versions, Saul had created 2 bands of soldiers, one led by himself and the other by Jonathan his son, in order to try and counteract the incursions of the Philistines. The 2 bands were pitched one on either side of a valley. Jonathan had attacked a garrison on his side of the valley, And following this attack, the Philistines had amassed a considerable army to overcome this skirmish and regain their supremacy. Seeing this overwhelming and better equipped army, many of the Israelites began to disappear into the rocks and caves. We read verse 8 of chapter 13. And he tarried 7 days according to the set time that Samuel had appointed. But Samuel came not to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. And Saul said, Bring hither a burnt offering to me and peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. And it came to pass that as soon as he had made an end of the offering, the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. And Saul went out to meet him, that he might salute him. And Samuel said, What hast thou done? And Saul said, Because I saw that the people were scattered from me, that thou camest not within the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered themselves again together at Michmash. Therefore said I, The Philistines will come down now upon me to Gilgal, and I have not made supplication unto the Lord. I forced myself, therefore, and offered a burnt offering. So we see that Saul was still seeking Samuel's advice at this time, and he had presumably settled into his role as king and had exerted his power in the setting up of an army, incidentally confirming the picture of the king that Samuel had warned the people that they would end up with. It would appear that he'd given specific instructions to Samuel, by Samuel, about waiting for him to arrive in order that they might make appropriate offerings to God prior to any military action. However, in the making of the offering himself, and not waiting for Samuel, Saul demonstrated an impatience and lack of understanding concerning religious matters. He makes excuses for his actions, blaming others, and doesn't appear to repent of his impetuosity. No doubt he thought he could make the necessary offering and then get on with his plans of fighting the Philistines. He didn't understand the priest's function in approaching God as he required. It seems that he considered the offering much as a tick-box action, something to be done before continuing with his plans. Verse 13, And Samuel said to Saul, Thou hast done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God, which he commanded thee. For now would the Lord have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever. But now thy kingdom shall not continue. The Lord hath sought him a man after his own heart, and the Lord hath commanded him to be captain over his people, because thou hast not kept that which the Lord commanded thee. Samuel was severe in his condemnation of Saul's actions. He tells him of God's displeasure in his actions and the fact that God was not going to support him in establishing his family as the royal house from this point. Had he obeyed, we are told, his royal line would have been established. Here the phrase forever must be taken as meaning an appropriate length of time, possibly for an undefined length. The Messiah was promised as a seed of Judah, and so Saul, a Benjamite, could not have been in the messianic line. There was war with the Philistines throughout Saul's reign, and as we read in 1 Samuel chapter 14, verse 52, and there was sore war against the Philistines all the days of Saul. And when Saul saw any strong man or any valiant man, he took him unto him. On one occasion, Jonathan and his armor-bearer climbed up to one of the Philistine garrisons and began to attack with subsequent disturbance, which led to confusion among the Philistines, that was aggravated by an earthquake, resulting in much slaughter, with the Philistines fighting themselves. Saul sees the apparent riot of his enemy and is unaware of the fact that Jonathan started it. He asks his men to find who is missing, and finds Jonathan and his armor-bearer have gone. Finding him missing, Saul and his army join in the rout, but he rashly commands his army not to eat anything until the evening. Was this an indication of his jealousy, being concerned that the victory being won might be deemed to be Jonathan's and not his? Jonathan, fatigued by his efforts, eats some wild honey and is revived. He then learns of his father's rash order. As soon as dusk fell, the troops began to kill and to eat some of the looted animals, not having drained the blood correctly. Saul, hearing this, organizes for a stone to be set up to slaughter the animals and builds an altar for sacrifice. Saul then orders his troops to chase the Philistines through the night. However, a high to the priests suggests seeking God's blessing first, but no answer is given. Presumably this was sought via the Urim and Thummim. Saul assumes this is due to some sin of the people, and again he acts rashly by saying that he who is found guilty must die. The lot falls on Jonathan. He admits to tasting some honey, and Saul pronounces his decision that he must die. The people, however, support Jonathan in view of the great victory he has wrought by God's help on the Philistines, and he is therefore saved. Again, we see rash orders being given, possibly the early signs of his jealousy being demonstrated in his actions, with potentially disastrous effect. So we begin to see the other side of Saul's character, the insecurity that leads to his frustration and humiliation, driven by his jealousy. However, it seems that the people were happy to accept him as their king. The army expanded, and he was successful in his battles, conquering the surrounding tribes and nations. 1 Samuel 14, verse 47. So Saul took the kingdom over Israel and fought against all his enemies on every side, against Moab and against the children of Ammon, and against Edom and against the kings of Zobar, and against the Philistines, and whithersoever he turned himself, he vexed them. And he gathered an host and smote the Amalekites, and delivered Israel out of the hands of them that spoiled them. So Saul had developed into a strong king militarily. From leading a band of soldiers who were deserting at the first opportunity, he now has formed a strong army that is able to conquer the marauding tribes and nations that surround Israel. It's interesting to note that we are told, "And when Saul saw any strong man or any valiant man, he took him unto him." So again, he was fulfilling the warnings of Samuel that he'd given the people after they'd asked him for a king to be over them. Saul was given what seems to be a second chance to redeem himself in the matter of the Amalekites. They had been a thorn in the side of Israel during their wilderness journey, as you remember. During the battle at Rephidim, when Amalekites attacked the Israelites, Moses' own arms had been held up in order that the Israelites might conquer them. They'd finally won, though the battle had ebbed and flowed between the armies until Moses' hands were held aloft. Moses recorded the battle on the scroll as the Lord requested of him. Exodus 17, verse 14. And the Lord said unto Moses, "Write this for a memorial in a book, and rehearse it in the ears of Joshua, for I'll utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven." Not only did they attack Israel here, but they followed the wandering tribes through the wilderness and harassed those who lagged behind. Deuteronomy 25, verse 17. Remember what Amalek did unto thee by the way, when you came forth out of Egypt, how he met thee by the way, and smote the hindermost of thee, even all that were feeble behind thee, when thou wast faint and weary, and he feared not God. Therefore it shall be, when the Lord thy God has given thee rest from all thine enemies round about, in the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance to possess it, that thou shalt blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven, thou shalt not forget it. The time had come when God's judgment was to be poured out on Amalek, and Saul was chosen to be the instrument of this judgment. 1 Samuel 15, verse 1. Samuel also said unto Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint thee to be king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore hearken thou unto the voice of the words of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, I remember that which Amalek did to Israel, how he laid wait for him in the way when he went up from Egypt. Now go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass." Saul sets out his army and encompasses round the city of the Amalekites. But initially, he again demonstrates his kindness towards the Kenites, some of whom lived amongst the Amalekites. And they were descended from Jethro, Moses' father-in-law. So he warns the Kenites to leave the towns of the Amalekites before he attacks them, which they did. Then he attacks the Amalekites and succeeds in destroying them right down to the border of Egypt, to Shur. But he didn't carry out the complete task told him by Samuel. Samuel 15, verse 7. And Saul smote the Amalekites from Havilah until thou comest to Shur, that is, over against Egypt. And he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag, and the best of the sheep, and of the oxen, and of the fatlings and the lambs, and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. But everything that was vile and refuse, that they destroyed utterly. God tells Samuel that night that he has rejected Saul, as he has not followed his commandment, and he repents of his decision in choosing him to be king. The Lord says, verse 11 of chapter 15, "It repenteth me that I have set Saul up to be king, for he has turned back from following me, and hath not performed my commandments." And it grieved Samuel, and he cried unto the Lord all night. So Samuel, hearing from God of Saul's failure, prays for him throughout the night. Next morning he goes to find him. However, he has already left, and with what was probably a large celebratory company to go to Carmel. We read that he set him up a place in the AV. The NRV translates this as, "There he set up a monument in his own honor." Samuel eventually catches up with him. When Saul meets him, he salutes him and says, "I have performed the commandment of the Lord." Samuel doesn't respond with a greeting, but asks what the bleating of sheep is that he hears and what it means. Saul, obviously realizing that Samuel somehow knows what has taken place, tries to justify his actions. He lies about what went on, blaming the people for saving the best of the livestock, and then suggesting that they kept the sacrificing to God. So we have further evidence of the shortcomings of Saul's character. He'd gone about the task of destroying the Amalekites in his own way. He presumed to know better. Was he perhaps concerned about the reactions of the people if he'd commanded them to completely destroy the livestock? Was he courting approval of the people? It seems more likely that he felt he could do better, that his way was just as good, demonstrating perhaps the shallowness of his knowledge of the religion and that his priorities were differently based. The whole episode of going about the task in his own way, of his attempts at making excuses for doing other than he'd been commanded, trying to pass the blame onto other people, reflected the deficiencies in his character, of his weakness and inability to stick to the plan. Samuel calls a halt to his hurried explanations as he delivers God's verdict. Verse 16. Then Samuel said unto Saul, "Stay, and I will tell thee what the Lord hath said to me this night." And he said unto him, "Say on." And Samuel said, "When thou wast little in thine own sight, wast thou not made the head of the tribes of Israel? And the Lord anointed thee king over Israel? And the Lord sent thee on a journey and said, Go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they be consumed. Wherefore then didst thou not obey the voice of the Lord, but didst fly upon the spoil, and didst evil in the sight of the Lord?" Then verse 22, and Samuel said, "Hath the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, he hath also rejected thee from being king." So Samuel shows Saul that in following his own inclinations, he's rebelled against God. He was rebelling against the whole principle on which the kingdom had been established. God had finally rejected him from being king. Previously, when he'd usurped the job of Samuel as priest and offered the burnt offering, God had told him that his family would not inherit the kingdom. There would be no dynasty. Now God is rejecting him as king. From this time, Saul's support from God was slowly withdrawn. Much as when Adam sinned and was told he would die, he began the slow process that ended in death, so Saul too lost the support of God. He didn't see Samuel again, we learn, though Samuel mourned for him. We see Saul then as an insecure man who enjoyed the power of his position, but he felt insecure and demonstrated the characteristic of paranoia. He was always concerned about his back, who was conspiring against him. We see this in his treatment of David, whom he knew would inherit the kingdom, but of whom he was always jealous. He liked to take credit for his successes, as we saw in his setting up a memorial to himself after the wrath of the Amalekites. He had a poor grasp of the religious aspect of life, ignoring Samuel's instructions at times. There are other aspects of his life that perhaps reflect a little of his character. We look at the episode of Nahash the Ammonite. When Nahash the Ammonite had been threatening the men of Jabesh, we read that the Spirit of God came mightily upon Saul, and his anger was kindled greatly. So what are we to make of this comment? If we look at other instances of God's Spirit working through men, we see that though God may work through various men, he doesn't change their personalities. There are examples of those who were evil, who performed acts in accordance with God's will. Balaam, for example, a man who was after his own advancement, was caused to bless Israel, though he is described as evil several times subsequently later in the scriptures. Saul is therefore helped on this occasion, though the incident has little effect on his character thereafter. He remained uncertain of what was expected of him. He was concerned about the people and what they would think of him. His later life was characterized by his envy, especially of David, his jealousies and his persistent fears of what was coming to him. God's Spirit may be given for particular purposes, but it doesn't impose any changes to a man's nature. We read that the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord came over him. But what can we make as the meaning of this? No evil can come from God, as he is goodness itself. There is no evil in him. Any evil that occurs is as a result of man's reaction to events. God has given man free will, and therefore any evil can be seen as a result of man's sin. Saul was solely responsible for his own actions and for the reactions to events in his life. He used David's music to soothe him when the dark moods came over him, but on several occasions his jealousy becomes uncontrolled, and he throws a javelin trying to impale both David and on one occasion Jonathan too. These actions demonstrate his bouts of uncontrolled rage. David had been introduced to the court to try and appease Saul's dark moods. He subsequently rose through the ranks as he excelled at everything Saul gave him to do. He attained a high rank in the army, and Saul, becoming jealous of his achievements and wondering how to be rid of him, sent him to fight against the Philistines, thinking the Philistines might kill him, and thus he would be rid of David. However, he becomes more successful than Saul, young maidens singing of his killing 10,000s to Saul's thousands. This, of course, was another cause of increasing his jealousy. What more can he have but the kingdom, Saul says. From this day forward, Saul eyed David, we read. He attempted to be rid of David again by giving him the task of collecting 100 foreskins of the Philistines as his dowry on the occasion of his wedding to Michal, hoping that this would prove a fatal endeavour. When Saul realized the Lord was with David and his daughter Michal loved him, he became afraid of David and became his enemy continually, we are told. His jealousy and rage again are demonstrated by the episode when he murders the priest at Nob. Saul had instructed his servants and Jonathan his son that they should kill David. Jonathan tells David of the threat to his life and promises to alert David to his father's wishes with respect to David. As a result, David flees to Ahimelech, the priest at Nob, and afterwards to the cave of Adullam. Saul hears of this through Deut the Edomite and takes his revenge by killing all the priests. Finally, he consults the witch at Endor. This episode probably reflecting his lowest ebb and superstitious nature. Saul had died, and Samuel was becoming more isolated, his army gradually reducing, and the Philistines were once again amassing on his border, causing him great concern. 1 Samuel 28. Verse 1, and it came to pass in those days that the Philistines gathered their armies together for warfare. to fight with Israel. Verse 5, and when Saul saw the host of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart greatly trembled. And when Saul inquired of the Lord answered him not, neither by dreams, nor by Urim, nor by prophets. So Saul seeks out an alternative source for what he hoped would be advice on how he should proceed to conquer the Philistines. Perhaps he'd considered the trappings of religious life, the priest's ephod with the Urim and Thummim and the Ark of the Covenant, as talismans that would bring himself in success in battle. At any rate, he was wanting some reassurance about the battle, surely a situation in which he had confidence in the past. Now, however, things were different. Samuel was dead. God he knew had deserted him, and Samuel told him his life he must have felt was falling apart. So he turns to seeking a witch, a familiar spirit. Earlier in his reign, no doubt under the instruction of Samuel, he had had all witches and wizards slain and removed from Israel. Endor was in the north of the land, possibly over the border into enemy territory. Quite what happened at Endor is open to debate, but Saul had his fears confirmed. It seems that the witch conducted a seance, using the general vagaries that such people used to convince Saul of the genuineness of her vision. It's interesting to note that Saul does not see Samuel himself. He has his worst fears confirmed. God has departed from him. He was going to be defeated in the ensuing battle. Indeed, both he and Jonathan were killed the following day. So ended the life of the king, who started with such promise. Initially, he potentially had many advantages. He was physically striking. He showed consideration for his aging father. He was humble enough to take advice from even his servant. He kept his calling quiet. And he was not confrontational to those who initially refused to accept him as king. He was humble enough to return to the family farm despite knowing of his election. However, he would appear to have had little religious experience or knowledge. His first real test, the trouble at Jabesh, went well. He convinced the people that he was their man to lead them into battle. He had demonstrated decisive thought and planning, military skill, and finally his mercy toward those who had doubted him. So he was accepted as the people's king. Following this, however, we see his impatience being expressed when he fails to wait for Samuel and rushes to complete his plan, rather than waiting to carry out God's wishes. He demonstrates a rather irreverent attitude towards the religious procedures, rushing to complete the sacrifice. Perhaps we see the start of the fact that his power is beginning to rule his actions. The next period in his reign concerned the wars with the Philistines. He demonstrates a rather rash military decision in chasing the Philistines and forbidding his men from eating. This ended with a potentially disastrous edict that Jonathan should die as he'd eaten some honey, he being saved by the common sense of the people. He does, however, wage many wars successfully on the local nations who harassed the Israelites. Then came the trouble with the Amalekites. Samuel had given him explicit instructions from God. And initially, he showed his merciful side again in that he warned the Kenites to escape before he attacked. However, he fails to fulfill God's commandment, keeping Agag alive. Was this so he could parade him through the streets to show his success? He lied to Samuel about saving the flocks. God repents of his choice of king. Samuel leaves Saul, not seeing him again till his death. So we see Saul as an insecure king, who though he revels in his power, is always on the lookout for supposed enemies, whether real or not. He would appear to need more reassurance to ease his insecurity as his life progressed. After Samuel left him, we're told, the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. It was after this that David was brought to soothe him through his music. David, as we've seen, was brought more into his life. He excels in battle, such that young women sing of Saul slaying his thousands, but David his 10,000s. This fed the insecurity and jealousy of Saul. And as we read, Saul eyed David from this time. He sees David as his rival and plots to get rid of him, even trying to get the Philistines to kill him by putting him in potentially dangerous situations. David proves his honor and loyalty to Saul as the Lord's anointed, sparing his life on 2 occasions. Saul later acknowledges that he would indeed be king. In his religious life, we see perhaps that Saul had a rather shallow understanding, despite being tutored by Saul. What can we take from this? Looking at Saul's character as his deficiencies, his main stumbling block appears to be a poor grasp of God's commandments, a self-reliance that was based on his fears, of his bitterness towards those he envied, and of his overwhelming jealousy. He would have been better advised had he taken Moses' word to heart. We too can benefit from his words, as indeed we can from all God's word. We should not let our hearts be lifted up above our brothers and sisters. We should read God's word daily and learn to fear the Lord our God, to keep his words, and to obey his statutes. Thank you.